When we think of prisons, if we bother to think of them at all, that is, there is a tendency to see them as institutions completely divorced from human society.
The Justice Department said today the inmate population of federal and state prisons in this country is at an all-time high.
The public sees a need for more prisons because crime is the #1 concern of the people in this state. Too many inmates and not enough space.
Another crime, another criminal, in a country already fed up with both.
People stacked up like cordwood in our prisons.
There's a population explosion in American
Overcrowding in this country's jails and prisons.
Prison populations are exploding.
A number of people are now being held behind bars.
Half the inmates in federal prison are drug
bars today.
The U.S., they say,
A shocking new number was released today, and it deserves our undivided attention. 1 out of every 100 Americans is now behind bars, locked up in prison or in jail.
The most important thing is to talk from your heart. If you have more than one child, give it like an overall message, but then do an individual one to each child. Throw them a kiss, talk to them about what you do daily. The rest should be just you. If you've written a poem, we've had people pray, we've had people sing. One guy showed his little boy how to shoot a basketball. Be creative. Okay, these are gifts to your children and your families. Okay, any questions?
The families are punished right along with the offender. People don't think so, but the collateral consequences of somebody's incarceration affects not just that whole family, but it affects the whole community. It affects you as an individual, whether you know it or not. And whether you know that person or not that's incarcerated, you're paying for them. You should care. I have background in film and video as a producer, and I thought there's got to be something I can do, so why not combine my career and my experience with the prison system and come up with something for these kids. When a parent looks in that camera, they're looking at their child, and if they can look at them and say, you know, this isn't your fault, you did nothing wrong, it means a lot. And for many of these men and women, it's the first time they've really taken responsibility, which is huge. And that's a first step in recovery of any kind, is to take the responsibility for it.
But even when I'm far away, this love I have will stay and wrap itself around you every minute of the day.
I just want you guys to know that I'm gonna do the best I can to stay out of this place and continue striving forward with my life. I've missed you guys all a lot. I'm glad this is the last Christmas I'm gonna have to spend away from y'all.
I just want you guys to know that I miss y'all. Can't wait to be with y'all. That's it. I love y'all. Take care. Mwah. I love y'all. Bye-bye.
Nice job.
Modern prisons are an invention of Quakers. Quakers had this idea that if you gave people an opportunity to silently reflect, to become penitent, leading to the term penitentiary, that they would reflect upon their misconduct and be reformed.
The first practical use of it was really in the United States, in Philadelphia, try to provide positive change and change someone's behavior, but it was partly as a movement to get away from corporal and capital punishment, to come up with something better. The problem and the thing that people forgot was going into a monastery voluntarily and isolating yourself in order to pray and think is very different than being pushed into a cell by the state. One of the things that seems to be true in the history of prison systems is that the philosophies change, but the buildings remain. So you have these massive buildings that are these major expenditures, and very often just used as essentially human warehouses. You would occasionally get people that would try different kinds of experiments in education and therapeutics in some way, in inmate self-government, but usually they were fairly quickly overwhelmed by the crowding in the system or because they were politically unpopular.
From 1920 until 1970, this whole half century of American history, the rate of incarceration was roughly level at about 110 per 100,000. And this is a broad span of our history. This is, the Roaring 20s and Prohibition, the Depression and all the social change there, World War II, the post-war economic boom, the 50s, the explosion of suburbia, the 60s and all the social turbulence. During this whole period, the rate of incarceration is roughly level in the United States at about 110 per 100,000. And this reflects, the policies of police departments and prosecutors and judges operating all over the country in local and state level. And then in 1970, this all changes. So that by now, the rate of incarceration nationwide is over 700 per 100,000. The rate of incarceration for African Americans is over 4,000 per 100,000. And so you have to wonder, what changed? Why did this half century of stability get upended with this dramatic increase in incarceration in the United States?
America's public enemy #1 in the United States is drug abuse.
Once the federal government decided that we were going to have a war on drugs, they were able to then take a lot of money from the federal budget and then send it out to states and localities.
I realize the need for money to deal with this problem. I am glad that in this administration we have increased the amount of money for handling the problem of dangerous drugs sevenfold. It will be $600 million this year. More money will be needed in the future.
Virtually everybody thought the drug war was the #1 issue. And so you had politicians in both parties and, district attorneys and elected sheriffs. Everybody wanted to get into drug cases and get aggressive about it.
First, I am recommending legislation making the penalty for all illegal trafficking in hard drugs a life sentence in prison.
The issue before the U.S. Supreme Court today, mandatory life sentences for possession of large quantities of drugs. That is the law in Michigan. California Governor Pete Wilson signed that state's new 3 strikes and you're out law. It requires a sentence of life in prison without parole for at least 25 years for anyone convicted of a 3rd violent felony.
Most of American policing is done at the state and local level. So although the federal government may have expanded, you may have seen bigger budgets for the DEA and the FBI and their drug investigations. The bigger impact was the sending of federal dollars down to state and local police departments, where they get to hire more officers, hire more prosecutors, and once you do that hiring, then they start arresting more and more people start coming into the system, and then you've got to expand the prison capacity.
New laws to punish them, new agents to arrest them, new prosecutors to convict them, and new prisons to hold them.
We moved to Trenton when I was very young. When we moved here, we moved, to Miller Homes. We used to always run up and down the hallways. Of course, it was the project, so sometimes we would sneak up on the roof, which was the top floor, 12th floor, and, look out. And of course, that was very scary as a young child. But, when you're living in the projects, there's only so much stuff that you can get into. My brother was tragically killed when he was ran over by the truck, and I remember specifically going to the corner where it happened at and seeing all the blood because they left all the blood still in the street. The traumatic experience of losing my only brother in that truck accident, I know it had done something to me, but, drugs were my escape.
That time was hard all the way around because my son was doing drugs, my nephews was doing drugs, my nieces was doing drugs, my sisters were doing drugs. It was like an epidemic of drug abuse, and I cannot explain it. I cannot explain my feelings because at that time I didn't know how I felt. You know, I was sad because I felt like they was ruining their lives, but there was nothing I could do about it to change their lifestyle. So that was it.
Most historians look at the origin of the war on drugs as something of President Nixon with his speeches and his creation of the DEA and other agencies in the 1970s. But the war on drugs as we understand it, with enormous caseloads and a filled up prison population, is really a feature of the 1980s under President Reagan.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
Under Reagan, there was a tremendous increase in federal spending for anti-drug activity, cabinet-level efforts, and Congress creating very powerful new laws. All of what we understand of the war on drugs today is really a creation of the 1980s.
On day 2 of his new campaign against drugs, the president backed up his tough talk with action.
We're getting tough on drugs, and we mean business.
It's almost like overnight we had this great idea. Hey, what if we go after the users? And that's what we did. We started going after the users, and the prison population soared because obviously there are far more users than there are operations, major operations. And we started treating sick people, people who were addicted to these drugs like criminals.
After my brother passed away, I kind of withdrew from a lot of things. I didn't talk as much. I was very quiet. Probably as early as my teenage years, 12, 13 years old, you know, I started sneaking and drinking a little bit here and there. Started smoking marijuana at a very young age.
I started selling drugs, and, you know, he came right along with it. You know, family, you tend to trust family.
Once I started selling loose joints, I graduated to selling nickel bags, and then I graduated to selling half ounces and ounces. So it was a slowly progression of me wanting more money, me wanting to do more, that I progressed from the legal side of shining shoes and cleaning windows to the illegal side of selling loose joints and nickel bags.
Well, when I first saw him, it was in the hallway, and I used to be a hall patrol monitor. And I was stationed right in front of his locker. So when I knew that he was coming to his locker, I would put my hands up and like block his way. So he would have to say, "Excuse me," or something. And after that, we started talking.
We got to know each other, you know, after walking her home many times and hanging out over at her house. You know, my home wasn't really a home compared to her house. Margaret grew up with her parents, both her parents home, in a nice, decent house. Great mother, great father. Something that I didn't have. And I started, you know, just being around her a lot and being around her family a lot. The next thing you knew, you know, I was pretty much, you know, once we started going together, I was pretty much living at her house at the age of 14, 15 years old. I was pretty much staying there because my mom was on drugs. She, you know, as long as she knew where I was at, she really didn't have a problem with it. But I kind of started, you know, living and staying with Margaret at a very young age. By the time I was 16, 17, I was fully engulfed in the drug game, and Trenton is only but so big. Trenton is only 7.5 square miles, so a lot of rumors had started spreading along to the Trenton detectives. Back then they had 2 detectives that worked the high school, and they kind of got to know me very well, and I guess they relayed that information to the Trenton narcotics, and they started watching me and following me around and stuff like that. And I remember the first time that they raided my house. I wasn't there, but my mother was there. And I was, I think I had just turned 17. And they locked her up, and I got a phone call saying that, you know, your mother was locked up and they wanted you to turn yourself in. So eventually I turned myself in at 17 and let my mother go. And first time me ever going to jail, I went to the youth house. Because I wasn't 18, I was only still a juvenile.
We were still in high school, and we missed the prom, and he missed graduation.
When I got out, I remember the detective telling me that, you know, as soon as I turned 18, that they was gonna come back and get me. And if I didn't straighten up my life, that first experience would be nothing compared to my other experiences in jail, because then I would be over 18 and I would be going into an adult facility.
The recent deaths of athletes Len Bias and Don Rogers have made drug abuse a political issue.
Len Bias, gone to high school here in Washington, went to the University of Maryland, which is right here inside the Beltway, and Bias was their star.
The world champion Celtics used their first-round draft choice to pick Bias to play for them after his graduation. This morning, Len Bias was dead, a cardiorespiratory arrest. No one knows why yet. There are reports that traces of cocaine were found in Bias's system.
The Speaker of the House is from Boston, Tip O'Neill, and people are stunned all over the country. How did this happen?
Here we are inside the D.C. Beltway. Congress just went crazy and emotionally started ramping things up and creating tough-on-crime policies related to drugs.
Last week, House Democrats said they would come up with a legislative package, and they criticized the president for failing to fund anti-drug efforts.
Unfortunately, there has been a failure to recognize the vital urgency of this problem.
But at the White House, they say they got to this issue first.
No, there's no politics going on here. I mean, 5 years ago, I've been doing this for 5 years, Chris.
The president has talked up a good argument in declaring war, but he certainly hasn't put together much of an arsenal.
Politicians in both parties say people are so concerned about drugs right now that no one in Washington can afford to be seen as ignoring the problem.
In July 1986, when the Democratic leadership figured out that this was a big issue and they wanted to make it the central issue of the election, they only had 4 weeks until the August recess, which is when people are going to go off and campaign. So that's a very short period of time. And they were asking committees that had nothing to do with drugs, small business, merchant marine and fisheries, post office and civil service. You know, everybody is supposed to kick in. Every House chairman who's a Democrat is going to contribute to this big, stew of legislation that's going to be brought to the floor right after Labor Day. So this is an incredibly short period of time to write very complicated laws.
No hearings, no research, no prison impact analysis, racial impact analysis, nothing. It was done as way too much legislation is done in this country, very thoughtlessly.
And if you're moving very, very fast and you don't have time to get the considered impact from people who are going to have to live with and carry out this law, you're going to make mistakes. We made mistakes.
My birthday was September the 12th, 1980. I turned 18. They came back and locked me up and caught me with drugs September the 16th. So they kept that promise that they made to me and fulfilled that promise. So once again, at the age of 18, I was back in jail, facing numerous drug charges this time. Because of my juvenile record, it was evident that I was going to do some time this time.
And when he came home, he got a job. He was on the right track. And then he just started back doing drugs, selling drugs. And at that time, we separated.
Even though I remember my first bid and I know the pain that I put my girlfriend and my family through and everything, my father and stuff like that, by 1988, it had become a complete distant memory for me. And sometimes drugs have a way of masking your memory. I knew jail was bad. I knew I never wanted to go back again. But when you're hooked on drugs, you just don't think about it.
You just don't want the money. You want everything else that come along with it. Because when you're at that level in the streets, you can lose your life. And sometimes drugs help you forget that part is still out there. I could just focus on the money so I can get high and I can float away.
I remember talking to my grandmother and having that conversation with her about my life and how far I had fallen. She said to me, Tracy, I'm going to always pray for you and I'm going to pray that you change your life around. And one of the things that she said that stuck with me was that, God is going to find you in your darkest hour. And only then will you realize who you truly are. And I heard her, but I really didn't hear her. And I left her house that Thanksgiving dinner and went right back out into the streets. I remember going to New York, the cop, and coming back from New York, coming down Route 1, coming through Union County. We We had drugs in the car, and we had a gun in the car. And I remember being stopped at a light and getting out and switching drivers. I got around to the passenger side, and she took the driver's seat. And not knowing that it was a cop car right behind us. So once again, I didn't want to go to court. I wasn't going to trial. I told my lawyer that, you know, we just had to try to get all the charges pushed together, get me one sentence, let me go do my time, and hopefully straighten out my life. But I remember specifically the judge, the sentencing judge, telling me that now I'm a two-time loser. And he said, Tracy, you was convicted in 1980, and now you're convicted again in 1988. He said, come back before me for the third time, and the third time is going to be a charm for you.
The direction to a judge to sentence can be done in two ways. You can say, Judge, here's a crime, and for this crime, you can impose a sentence anywhere in this range from probation to some term of years imprisonment. The other way is to say, Judge, you must impose some minimum number of years or months of imprisonment and go up from there. So a mandatory minimum is a sentence where no matter how minor the role of the offender, no matter how insignificant a violation of this crime it is, a minimum term must be imposed.
So I have all this, and then we get into personal data of the family. You'll see as you read this, this gets really right down to the nitty-gritty. Removed from the home at 6 years old and placed in foster care. Attempted suicide several times during childhood, starting at age 7. And where this individual was placed in the course of their juvenile activity, what their physical condition is, what their mental and emotional health is. In this case, we have some diagnoses of all kinds of problems. This takes quite a while for a pre-sentence officer to put this together, but I certainly have a pretty good idea what I'm dealing with. Substance abuse, lots of that in this particular case, methamphetamines. Education, that's a little bit short. Employment, you know, here, there, and everywhere, but not much. Financial condition, that's usually real skimpy. And then this is the 5-year minimum, maximum 40 years, guideline range, 168 to 210. That's the initial guideline range, and what the sentencing options are. Bureau of Prisons, what they charge to keep them, which never means anything to us. And then Mr. Heinck has signed his name on this 30-page pre-sentence report. So I have this whole thing to look at. I finished this. There's not much more I need to know about this individual, more than I ever wanted to know.
Mandatory minimum sentences are not new. They've been on the books in this country for 200 years. And there are about 190 of them or something. And if you look at them, they read like the crime du jour. So you can see what the public was concerned about, and then Congress took that concern and translated it into law, into sentencing legislation. So piracy on the high seas in like 1790s got you life without parole. Robbing banks and crossing state lines in 1934 was, 10 years in prison. Skyjacking in the 70s was 10 or 20 years in prison. And so you can see that what the headlines were. The headlines were translated into a mandatory sentence. And so in the 80s, when drugs became a big deal and lots of concern about drugs, it was in the top 3 of public concern. Congress reacted by creating new mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes.
I started work for the House Judiciary Committee in November 1979. I had just turned 30. Very young lawyer, not quite 4 years of experience practicing law, to work rewriting the entire federal criminal code for Father Drinan, the chairman of the Criminal Justice Subcommittee. A few months later, Drinan announces he's not running for re-election and is out of Congress within 14 months. And so I was traded in the beginning of 1981 to the House Crime Subcommittee, to Congressman Hughes, the new incoming chairman, where my responsibilities were writing federal law dealing with drugs, gun control, money laundering, organized crime, pornography, and a host of other issues.
In the 1950s, the practice of giving mandatory sentences as a deterrent became fairly widespread. By the 1970s, the consensus was they weren't fair and didn't work, and there was no reduction in drug crimes, so a great many of the mandatory terms were dropped. Well, now they're back.
When I was asked, Eric, give us a mandatory minimum proposal in this week in August, as this is being put together, I said, okay, let's see what the Justice Department is defining as the highest level traffickers, and we'll give them these mandatory sentences. These were hundreds of thousands of doses of drugs a month for at least 6 months. So when I bring this back to the subcommittee in our markup, Congressman Ron Mazzoli from Louisville, Kentucky looks at this and says, well, wait a minute. We don't have drug dealers that big in Louisville. We're not going to use this statute in Louisville. Now, no one turned to Ron and said, Ron, nobody goes to Louisville to do a dope deal. It ain't Miami. It's not Houston. You should be glad you're not going to need this in Louisville. But instead, it was, oh, yeah, Ron's right, yeah. These high-level traffickers, they're too high level. Eric, bring us something else.
It's all based on one factor, your sentence. What was the drug and how much of it did you have, and that determines your sentence. So culpability no longer really plays a major role in a person's sentence when the crime carries a mandatory minimum.
What Congress sent to President Reagan was 5-year mandatory minimum, 5 grams of crack cocaine. A gram is like a sweet and low packet. 10 years minimum is 50 grams of crack cocaine. That's like the weight of a candy bar. These are tiny quantities.
It goes back to the analogy of a traffic ticket with a $100 cost. Up or down, good attitude, bad attitude, doesn't make any difference. It's $100. And it's that same kind of theory that's applied over into these mandatory minimums in these serious crimes. We don't care what your attitude is. We don't care how much education you had. We don't care what the ameliorating circumstances were you did it. So therefore, and a lot of us, human nature doesn't work quite that way. And that's why we say, wait a minute. This is not what we're here for. We're here as judges, trained, dedicated to look at the whole picture and come to a just result.
The thing that mandatory minimum sentences do is they completely remove the judge from the sentencing equation. And so a person who has never laid eyes on you, some legislator in Washington sitting on Capitol Hill, is determining your sentence by saying, well, if the person has, 50 grams of methamphetamine, it's a 5-year sentence. So it's like, really? I mean, who do you want to determine your sentence? Someone you've never seen or who has never seen you, or the judge who's in the courtroom and has the most information they can about your case?
I think the fear and the flexibility is your liberal judges are going to give a lower sentence and your hard-nosed judges are going to give a high sentence, and therefore we're going to have variances. And I say variances come with people. Certain variances come with people. Certain communities are different than other communities. There are some more liberal communities, and they have more liberal judges. Let them get what their community wants, we're all frail human beings trying to do the best we can. And one can sometimes look at a sentence of mine and say, why in the world did he do that? Well, they weren't here. They didn't see what I had to look at. Maybe my eyes will look at it differently than others. But I have a colleague that has a reputation for being a little more liberal than I. But when I compare that colleague's sentences to mine, roughly, no, that person's not anymore. If I'm conservative and they're liberal, that doesn't work when you compare the actual sentences. Because the actual sentences in this particular case, that person's is sometimes heavier than mine. But it all depends on the facts of the case that we approach it with. And that's the way it should be. That's the way it should be. Because sentencing should be individualized.
When President Reagan signed the mandatory minimums in 1986, the federal prison population was 36,000. Now it's well over 200,000. This is a growth that no one could have imagined.
Mass incarceration in the U.S. is really unique in human history. There's no democratic nation that's ever tried to have such a massive social experiment as we've done in incarceration.
We have more prisoners than any other country in the world ever, by rate and numbers. I mean, I find it a bit disturbing that we have more prisoners than China, and they have 1 billion more people than we do.
I don't think it gives people enough pause when they hear that we have 25% of the world's prison population and only 5% of the world's population. In other words, we We are way over-incarcerating compared to any other country in the world.
Here's the thing that I think the public really doesn't understand about jailing in the United States is that it's not just detention anymore. That's what it used to be. It used to be just about detention. But now, in addition to detention, we are now the largest mental health facility in your community. Wherever you live, if you go to the jail, they are a mental health facility. Because there's no place in the community that will take care of the certain kinds of population who have a mental illness and violate the law. In addition to that, we're a hospital in the community. We have to meet all the HIPAA regulations for being a hospital in order to provide inmate medical care. In addition to that, according to the federal government, we have to be a school for people who are under the age of 21, who are learning disabled. We have to provide an equivalent high school education. A GED will not suffice. So a team has to come in, do an assessment, and provide equivalent education. So we're not just about detention. We're a hospital, we're a mental health facility, and we're a school. And we have to do all of those things in one package with all of the unique different types of characteristics and individuals that are in here. It's a very, very comprehensive mission today to be in corrections.
I think originally the purpose of prison is to put people that are dangerous and are a threat to the society in a place that keeps them away from us for some period of time, either till they've redeemed themselves or been deemed unfixable. But we are so far beyond that original model. We really do seem to think that we can solve our social ills by simply incarcerating people.
I had allowed somebody to use a storage unit of mine, and the police found it, and they came after me. I ended up literally holding the bag. I knew nothing about the criminal justice system. You know, here I was, this middle-class mom, career, never even a parking ticket. And it was quite a surprise when we went to court, and I got that kind of time for marijuana. I was charged with possession of marijuana with the intent to distribute, and I got a conspiracy charge. I received a total of a 55-year prison sentence. The judge suspended all but 6. I was fortunate enough to make first parole, and I actually served in prison 14 months and came home. These are the cards that we put in with the messages and asked the families to respond. So we've gotten some really good responses. And this one was 3 members of the family viewed it. And we asked what were the ages of the children who saw it, and she put just one age. She put 6. She says extremely meaningful for the daughter of the mother who was incarcerated. She loved it. We all did. And this one said, what did the message mean to your family? To know their family was okay. That's a huge part. These children want to know that their family's okay, that their mom or dad's okay.
There's so much I want to say to you, because I know it's been 3 years since any of you seen me. I missed you all so much, and I greatly appreciate everything you have done for me. Nothing's your fault. Jessica, Erica, nothing's y'all's fault. And anyone else in the family that I've done that y'all may feel that you're in the fault, it's been me. I've grown up a lot in this time, these last 3 or 4 years. Grown up a lot. Just want to say that. I love you. Bye. Merry Christmas.
They sentenced me to 1 year administrative segregation. And administrative segregation is 23-hour lockup. You're locked up for 23 hours each day. You come out for a half-hour shower and a half-hour break. I've never been a violent person. At that time, I was treated like one of the worst violent persons in the world. I remember going into that cell, and I believe it was maybe a 5-by-8 cell. And once that door closed, I knew I was going to be there for the next year. It's just an experience that It's either going to make you or break you. You're either going to come out a better person or you're going to come out a worse person than you were before you went in. Being in the hole is an experience that I wouldn't wish on anybody. When you're locked up for 23 hours, the only thing you can do is think. My words of my grandmother just kept playing over and over again in my mind. And those words was that God was going to find me in my darkest hour. And only then would I realize who I truly was. And when I kept hearing that, I kept saying, I am at my darkest hour. I am at my lowest point. And I think right then I realized that I had reached my lowest point in life. And that the only other way for me to go from here was up.
Another crime, another criminal, in a country already fed up with both.
Freedom is rights.
Politicians say the solution is simple: crack down.
The reason the criminal justice system isn't working is that we're not sending enough people to jail and keeping there long enough.
The people are saying, in a very general way, that they want to lock these rascals up and keep them there for a long time.
During the 1980s, there was a major shift in the Congress and in state legislatures about how long sentences should be. The public was alarmed by increasing rates of crime from the 1970s and early 80s, and they wanted longer sentences. They wanted cracking down. And that's what happened across the board for all kinds of crimes, not only the mandatory minimum drug sentences.
Congress in 1984 established a U.S. Sentencing Commission made up of 7 members. 4 had to be federal judges, no more than 4 from one party, a very bipartisan effort. And those members were given the instructions to create a sentencing guideline systems for all crimes, not just drugs, any federal crime. And it would give the judges a starting point, and then they would go up or down on a grid depending on the culpability of the defendant and a few other factors.
At the same time, Congress decides to jump in with the mandatory minimums of 1986. So before the sentencing guidelines have really been shaped, we now have long mandatory sentences for low-level drug offenses. So the Sentencing Commission now has to build guidelines on top of the mandatory minimums. So that a consequence was that drug trafficking that might not have been so serious, let's say trafficking in 10 kilos of crack cocaine, now got you a life sentence under the sentencing guidelines.
The effect of all those sentencing laws was not just to increase the sentences that people were exposed to, so that people were serving longer time in prison than they did before. It was also to take the discretion away from the sentencing discretion, away from judges and juries, and shift it over to prosecutors. It didn't eliminate discretion. It just gave prosecutors the power to determine what your sentence was going to be by making charging decisions, and even by bargaining over what the facts of your case were. So it didn't mean that discretion was eliminated from the system. It just put the prosecutors in charge.
Prosecutors can negotiate with you behind closed doors. It's not open to the public. It's not reviewable. There's no appeal available in the way that you're negotiated with. And they can basically say to you, if you plead guilty or if you cooperate and you give us other names, we'll cut you a deal and we'll only charge you with one of these charges instead of these 3. And you'll get 5 years instead of 15. So all of that goes on behind closed doors. And they say to you, if you don't cooperate with us, if you don't agree, we're going to file a motion because you have a prior from 10 years back. We're going to file a motion called an 851. And if you go to trial and lose, your 5-year sentence is going to be doubled to 10. Or your 10-year sentence is going to be doubled to 20. Or we can even, if you've got 2 priors, it'll put you in prison for life. But all the decision about how they charge these, what charges they bring, knowing what the sentences will be, that's all done behind closed doors. It's absolutely not open to the public. It's not open to review by a court even. And so the power of the prosecutor is huge in determining sentences today. And I don't think prosecutors are per se bad people, but I think power is seductive. And they have a lot of power and they like it and they get to not just rack up a victory, a win, but they can also say, and he's going to prison for 25 years.
Amy was born in 1960, and she was very, very shy. But by the time she got in high school, people confided in her. She played basketball. She made good grades.
High school that we went to was 7th through 12th grade. I was kind of the little tag-along sister. Amy and my brother were friends, and Amy and my sister were friends, but I just kind of watched her. She was always really friendly, always really nice.
This is a small town, and everybody knows everybody. If she got in trouble, we'd know about it pretty soon.
I had what I consider an idyllic childhood. At some point when I'm in college, I meet a guy that works for Southwest Times Record, the newspaper there in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And he asked me if I would be a subject for him to go out and take some modeling photos. We went to like several locations, and he instilled in me that I really ought to pursue a modeling career, or consider it.
My mother says, did you know Amy Ralston moved to Dallas? I was like, oh my gosh, no. Mom, what's she thinking? What's she gonna do? And so, well, I think she's going to model.
So I created a little portfolio before I went to Dallas that I could show to the modeling agencies. I was on a double date, wasn't really interested in the guy that I'd been set up with, and Sandy approached me and asked me if I'd like to go out, and I rejected his offer, and he looked so deflated, so I said, well, if you can remember my phone number, you can call me. Sure enough, he called. A week or so later, we went on a date. He was well-read, well-traveled, well-educated, graduated Stanford Law School, had gone to Princeton Theology School. So it was very appealing to be around somebody who I was frankly very impressed with and so fascinated with. And 8 months later, we were getting married at the Dallas Arboretum, and all of our family and friends were there, and it was, at that point, seemed like a dream come true. There were red flags before we got married. Frankly, there were red flags all along the way. Sandy has what I consider to be a dual personality, and that this other character would emerge whenever he drank. I literally had to do something radical. The only remedy to remove him from my life was for me to leave Dallas. I had to leave Dallas, and I had to leave all my friends behind and completely move to a different city.
Amy finally left Sandy, but he wouldn't leave her.
I just kept saying, let's be friends, let's be friends. He wanted it to be more. So he told me that he was going to Europe, and then I never heard anything for a while. The word got back to me that he'd been arrested. I hadn't been in Dallas in over a year, so the only thing I knew to do was to book a flight and go to Dallas and see if I could go through the house, listen to the answering machine, and try to piece this thing together, and eventually you think you're going to find out more information. And while I was in the Dallas house, the phone rang, and it was Sandy's German legal counsel who'd been assigned to the case in Germany. And at that time, he gave me very thin details, but said that Sandy had been arrested for manufacturing ecstasy, and that he wanted me to retain an attorney for him there in Dallas. It was a pretty interesting revelation, but I did. There was money in the safe that was in the house in Dallas, and I took that money and I retained an attorney to go over and meet with Sandy in Germany. 7 months after Sandy's been arrested, and I pull into the garage. My car is rushed by law enforcement people who are screaming and have a gun out, and they're pointing it at my face. I'm being told, you're in hot water. We know that your husband was arrested. We know you visited him in Germany. And they said, we know you have information. And all you have to do is just tell us what you know. And I wasn't going to say anything, because I'm literally watching these people destroy my home. This isn't somebody that I really want to confide in. So it wasn't very long after that my lawyer explained to me exactly what it is that my prosecutor wanted.
They wanted her to wear a wire and try to implicate other people she didn't even know. And she refused to do it. She said, I don't know these people, and I'm not going to do this. And this prosecutor said, you either cooperate, and I'm paraphrasing now, You either cooperate or we'll ruin your life.
I was in Los Angeles, it was March of 1991, and I go over and I look out the window, and there they are. So I was arrested that day.
Her father and I wanted her to plea bargain, but I understand Amy is not going to implicate somebody and make a criminal out of them when she doesn't even know, just to save her own skin. Now that's not my daughter. So she wouldn't do this, and as a result, they ruined her.
I could not plead guilty to everything that they accused me of. So I pled not guilty, and ultimately I was convicted for conspiracy, and I received a 24-year sentence.
There's a way in which you have to see the conspiracy law as a very important tool of law enforcement. If the crime is selling drugs, and some man in Miami sells 20 kilos of cocaine to an undercover agent, you want to ask, who is the seller working for? Where does the money go? If the money goes back to a drug lord in Colombia, who's going to keep the proceeds, he's in the conspiracy even though he actually wasn't there when the sale took place. He's a conspirator. And so part of the goal of the conspiracy law is to make sure that the most senior level of those in the criminal organization are justly punished. The problem is when you flip it around and the lowest level people in the criminal organization get punished just like they're the kingpin. And that's the big problem in the way in which the conspiracy laws are being applied.
I ended up in federal prison in Dublin, California. I realized that I would need to spend a lot of time in the law library, and I needed to familiarize myself with my case and everything that had gone wrong. If you furthered the conspiracy one step, you're guilty for everything in the conspiracy, no matter when you entered the conspiracy. It could have been on the last day. So because I had collected some money, I technically was guilty of conspiracy and was held responsible for everything that everybody else had done. And my sentence, my 24 years, was established based on the sum total of all the ecstasy that Sandy had manufactured. That's where my years came from. My years didn't come from things that I did. It came from 3-point-something million tablets of ecstasy that he had manufactured, puts me on the chart at this level, which is 24 years. That's how a judge sentences you, based on a chart.
You end up being subject, the way the sentencing laws apply to conspiracy, you end up being subject to being punished for all the conduct that everybody in the conspiracy has been involved in. So the idea of proportional punishment can be lost if this triggers a mandatory sentence.
One of the most controversial things about the way the federal criminal justice system works now is something called the trial penalty. And so it's just become standard practice that prosecutor will go to a defendant and say, you know, you've been charged with a crime and you're either going to plead guilty and cooperate or we're going to crush you. And so the defendant is confronted with a favorable offer for a plea agreement if he pleads guilty, and potentially decades in prison if he exercises his constitutional right to go to trial, because he's not going to get any credit for accepting responsibility if he goes to trial.
Prosecutors have a lot of discretion to add charges to people. You know, this falls under the category of like throwing the book at somebody. Sometimes they have that discretion, and they do not want people exercising their right to a jury trial, so they will threaten people. And the courts have upheld this tactic. It's not like they're doing something under the table. But if people insist on their right to a jury trial, they face the prospect of the judge imposing a mandatory minimum sentence or the prosecutors adding charges. And that's the type of pressure that they face and why so many do plead guilty.
To add insult to injury, while I'm incarcerated for 24 years, He comes back to the US and goes before the same judge that sentenced me to 24 years, and he got 3 years probation because he cooperated and snitched out everybody.
The person who comes in early and cooperates usually ends up with a lower sentence than the person in the conspiracy who walks up 2 days before the trial and tenders a plea. That sentence will be different. Even though they may be situated the same, it's just plain different. And those are the yings and the yangs of the sentencing process that the court has not a whole lot of control over. And the U.S. attorneys and the prosecuting attorneys have control over. But it does result in a different sentence.
When you are facing a mandatory minimum drug sentence, there is only one way out. You must offer substantial assistance to the government in the prosecution of someone else. That means you've got to work for the government. It means you've got to set up someone else. You need to give information to the government that leads to the prosecution of others.
When you're facing something like 20 or 30 years, you have people that are do things they never thought they would do, which is turn in their friends, testify against friends. Sometimes they will even make up false information to testify falsely against people just in order to get themselves out from under the terrible legal situation that they are in.
The pressure to provide information is huge and coercive and un-American. But that's the way mandatory minimums are set up.
My mother calls me and she said, well, I need to tell you something. And I'm thinking the worst. She said, well, Amy is featured in Glamour magazine. She's been in prison for a number of years.
And why that was such a catalyst was suddenly we had something tangible to hand to people.
The community found out and my brother got involved and of course my father and Senator Bumpers and Senator Pryor, and everyone started actually looking into the case and seeing, well, what could have possibly happened here? This just doesn't seem right.
My story and case started gaining momentum, and we got, I think, up to 15 politicians who wrote letters supporting my clemency.
When I read it, I was sympathetic to her because I thought that her husband was the primary driver of the offense. She was clearly had a subordinate role in the offense. And she was caught up in the web of these conspiracy laws that are extremely broad-ranging, and you don't have to do very much to get yourself stuck in a case like that.
I went to my case manager's office and walked in the door, and she said, she was in a frenzy, and she said, you know, where are you going to release to? And I was like, what do you mean? And she said, where are you going to live when you get out of prison? And I said, well, I guess with my parents for a while. And she said, because I've got to set you up on probation. And I said, why? And she said, you're going home. And I couldn't process it. I was just like, and so my reaction was, I think I was sitting down. So I stood up, and then I sat down, and I stood up, and I sat down. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, you've gotten executive clemency. President Clinton has ordered you out, and you have to be out today by 5 o'clock.
The president had granted her petition, and she was home that afternoon, that evening. They let her out that day.
It was really great because we always got bad news in there. Nobody ever got good news. And it was really nice to have all the women walk me across the compound. And there was that moment on the compound of victory. But it was really hard too, because you have to leave so many people behind.
We can confidently say today that we are finally beginning to win the war against crime.
Now is the time to show drug users that we mean to reach our goal of a drug-free generation in the United States.
You will be put away and put away for good. 3 strikes and you are out. The primary mission of the drug war, as stated by the Nixon administration, is to create a drug-free society. That's what it's all about. That's why we spend the billions of dollars and incarcerate millions of people, is to create a drug-free society. And we've been at this now good and hard for 40 years, trillions of dollars into it, no end in sight really. And when a reasonable person says, how much closer are we to creating a drug-free society, you begin to realize that perhaps we've been given a mission here that is impossible to achieve.
As it relates to these drug laws, we went out and arrested anyone we could find who were either using drugs or selling drugs. And you try to personally remove yourself from that. No, this is just our job. This is what we do. And we have no idea of how we're affecting society. You don't think about that.
It lines up perfectly with alcohol prohibition. When you look at alcohol prohibition, the richest man in the country was Al Capone. He controlled it. If you tried to get in his market, he would kill you. There were all kinds of, sub-factions. They tried to manufacture it in their bathtubs and stills. It was unsanitary. You didn't know what it was cut with. Sometimes it had antifreeze. People would drink this and go blind. People would drink it and get cirrhosis. Kids would die in the crossfire. It sounds all too familiar because it's exactly what's happening on the streets today in the United States when it comes to gang violence and the drug war. The DEA has said the majority of gang violence in the United States is over illegal drug marketplace disputes, fighting for that territory.
We saw violent crimes go through the roof as these criminal gangster organizations fought one another. So we're seeing that type of phenomenon today in our major metropolitan areas like Los Angeles, the Crips against the Bloods, and of course the horrendous violence that we're seeing in Mexico and in places like South America as these very rich, powerful cartels fight one another.
You know, as a police officer for many years, I policed and really thought nothing about the effects of my work. But when I retired from the Maryland State Police in 1999 and started working for the Baltimore Police Department as a commander of training, that very year I had a good friend of mine, Ed Totley, who was working undercover for the Maryland State Police. He was working on a Safe Streets campaign with the FBI on a task force, and he was assassinated by a drug dealer where he was buying cocaine from him. That made me stop and think for a while. It drew me right to the violence of this business.
A lot of people blame drugs and not prohibition, when this is really the problems, the violence around drugs. What is destroying cities and communities is much more prohibition than it is the actual drug.
One of the problems that we have with drug prohibition is it's so lucrative of a business. You can make so much money in such little time. And the difference between arresting someone for dealing drugs and arresting someone for committing rapes or burglaries, when you arrest a rapist or someone committing burglaries, you know what? The rapes stop. The burglaries stop. But when you arrest someone for dealing drugs doesn't stop on that corner. You just create a job opportunity for someone else to come in. And unfortunately, when that job is filled, there's usually some fighting going on, some shooting, and people get hurt.
Drug enforcement is relatively an easier kind of crime to prosecute because the government gets to control the commission of the crime. You pick your target, you trick them when to show up. If you're the government, you actually maybe provide drugs to the case. Ordinary kinds of crime, you've got to investigate what happened, who did it. You've got to gather evidence sometime after it happened. So that the challenge of investigating robbery, murder, burglary, those take lots of resources, and there's much lower return. You can do lots and lots of investigations and never find the target.
We evaluate you as a police officer many times on the number of arrests that you make. So the more arrests that you make, the better your evaluation. The better your evaluation, the quicker you're going to get promoted. Also, if you're out there making arrests, you can work more overtime. You work more overtime, you get more money. It's very easy to make large numbers of arrests in Black and poor communities because the drug dealing occurs on our street corners out in the open. And it's very easy for anyone to go in, any police officer to go in and just scoop up a large number of people on any given day. We need to change the incentives for our police officers.
The other piece of it is With drug cases, there's asset forfeiture. You can get all the property that's associated with the drug trafficking offense. The cars, the real estate, the airplanes, and that money goes into your agency's budget. So you get a very powerful economic incentive to do this kind of work, especially when times are hard.
The emphasis of our criminal justice system should be on violent offenses. This is what most people are concerned about. They want murderers apprehended, they want murderers and rapes solved, and they want these people taken out of the community and locked away in prison so that our communities can be safe.
I think a significant problem in policing is the limited resources that we have. And if you look at the data, in the late 1960s, before the drug war, we were solving 9 out of 10 murders in this country. We made arrests for 9 out of 10 murders in this country. Today, that number is 6 out of 10. And those numbers are similar for other violent crimes, such as rapes and robberies. And we know it's directly related to us being misdirected within the law enforcement community, focusing on drug crimes. I mean, we have better technology, we have computers, we have DNA. We should be solving more murders. We should be better at that. Another significant piece here is that the relationship between police and community has been broken. It's severely broken, and that's because we go into these communities looking for drugs every day. It's 70% of what we do every day. Illegally searching people, searching their cars, racial profiling. And because of this conflict, we don't get the information we need from the community to solve crimes. Any police officer, any chief who knows his business will tell you that we cannot be effective in preventing and solving crime without the cooperation of the community. We've lost it completely.
So I was a colonel in the war on drugs during the 1980s when I worked for the US Congress, writing these drug laws, overseeing the Drug Enforcement Administration, going to their secret intelligence center, going to their laboratories, watching what they were doing. And at a certain time, you begin to say, is this strategy capable of working? Are we going to stop the drug traffickers? Well, it's many years later, and the answer is clearly we have not. You look at Mexico, and the drug traffickers are running amok. You look at the headlines, and we're having heroin overdose epidemic. It's worse than it's ever been. What we've been doing is not working, and I would suggest it can't work. It can't work for a very important economic reason, which is that the harder you squeeze the drug traffickers and try to create a scarcity, the more valuable you make the drugs. And the more valuable you make the drugs, the more people who will come in to make those profits. If the price of anything goes up, more people are going to go into it. So that the very economics of what you're trying to accomplish guarantees more people are going to sell drugs. It's illogical. It's fundamentally illogical. It's irrational to think that drug enforcement can stop the supply of drugs, because it doesn't make any economic sense.
I don't know what the criminal justice world would be like without the war on drugs. My only experience of it has been during the war on drugs. I mean, I started FAM in 1991. The war on drugs really heated up in the 80s, kept rolling through the 90s. You know, it sort of started tapering off in the 2000s, but it's still alive and well.
It was like a pounding thunder of anti-drug hysteria in 1986. We must do something, anything, and that meant grasping at straws and not looking ahead at what the costs are going to be or what might be effective.
While I was on the Hill, I increasingly became convinced that the war on drugs was a mistake. It was counterproductive, and I wanted to put my energy into ending it. And so in January 1989, I started the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, and that has been the opportunity for me for the last 25 years to mobilize different kinds of strategies to end drug prohibition. A lot of it has been through other organizations. I helped start Families Against Mandatory Minimums in my office. I'm still very active with Students for Sensible Drug Policy. and with law enforcement against prohibition. And so a lot of my work is advocacy, strategizing, what are the ways to change drug policy and reform the criminal justice system. There are countless numbers of people who are in prison for inconceivably long sentences for being minor offenders in the drug trade.
These are just a handful of, files from Families Against Mandatory Minimums, where these people, James Belt, life sentence, Donnell Clark, 35 years, Timothy Tyler, life sentence, Sharonda Jones, life sentence. This is not an aberration. This is the lifeblood. This is the typical case. This is the typical pattern. Clarence Aaron, who's out in numerous cases. I mean, these are all excessively long cases. These are, do you see Colombian drug lords here? Do you see Mexican, Chapo Guzman? Do you see the Mexican drug lords here? No.
I was so glad to start to work my way out of the prison. So going to Clinton House was a halfway house. You were halfway home, but you were still in prison. So when I got to Clinton House, I already had some experience in doing roofing. I had a roofing background. I called my old boss up.
He was in the halfway house at the time, and I think someone, I don't know what company had him doing roofing, and his mother came to me and asked me would I buy him a pair of shoes that he needed to do his roofing, and he just blossomed. He just blossomed from there.
When I came out of prison and he had a job, and he says, hey, cuz, he came by, man, nice to see you home. And I said, yeah, all the time. My mind was thinking maybe I can get me some money, because I heard he got a job, I can get me some money and I can get up and running. But me, with that old stinking thinking, was trying to get him to come in because I can't trust nobody. He said, man, I'm not living like that no more. And I really didn't believe that because I couldn't see myself disconnecting myself from it. So I couldn't believe it for nobody else. But he showed me. He didn't tell me. He showed me. He stayed loyal and cut it out for real. And that's what I admired the most about him, because he was in a bad place like I was.
I was so happy to be at work and to have the ability to work again that I never missed a day. I was always there. I was always there an hour early before anybody else get there. So in essence, I was hungry. I was hungry to work. I was hungry to be free and had the ability to change my life around. So all those things made me a good employee. And I think he's seen that in me. And he allowed me to work my way up from labor to mechanic to foreman to supervisor within a matter of a couple of years.
And then that's when he just made his mind up and said that he was going to go into business for himself. And that's how it all started.
I just really felt that I had what it took to be an entrepreneur and to be successful. So I quit my job and I was fully fledged into business. And I believe my first year in business, I made about $30-something thousand in my first year. And I remember investing back into the business and buying tools and buying ladders. So I'm growing the business, and I think my second year I probably did about 80-something thousand. Third year I did about 100-something thousand. So I'm slowly but surely progressing. So now I'm up to $500,000 a year. The next thing I know, I'm up to $700,000 a year. And then in early 2000, 1999, early 2000, I finally went over the $1 million mark. And I said, wow, I never thought that I would own $1 million business.
A person has to have a dream. They have to want to do better for themselves. You can bring a person out of prison and they can have nothing and they can make something of themselves if that's what they want. But if you have low self-esteem You don't think good about yourself. So when you come out, you're not going to think good, so you're not going to get better. So when you start thinking that I'm better than this, then that's when you can overcome the obstacles that are in your way at the time that's blocking you from a dream. But you have to have that dream. You have to want better for yourself. And that's hard for people that are coming out of prison.
Not having the ability to, number one, get a job. Not having the ability to redeem yourself. I think that's where the recidivism rate goes through the roof, because you have people that are coming home from jail that are looking for opportunities. And I know they're looking for opportunity because my office is located on Martin Luther King Boulevard. A lot of them come to my office. I hear so many times guys tell me, Trace, I just need an opportunity. Trace, I just need a job. Trace, I don't want to go back to what I used to do. Tracy, if you just give me a chance, I'll prove to you that I got value in me. And that hurts. You know, when you look at a lot of these guys, I know for a fact that a lot of guys are good people. Everybody that goes to prison is not a bad person. So when you look at folks that I know that want to change their life, that are just looking for an opportunity to change their life but never get it, it's hard not to go back to where you know you can make $1. And I've seen it happen so many times. You know, I've seen guys that say, Tracy, I tried. I couldn't get a job. So here I am back out in the streets. Here I am back to doing what I've always done.
When you lived a certain way for so long and came as far as he did, he came a long way. That needs to be put out there, because a lot of people don't know how to break the change from this street thing. That thing get a hold of you, that thing will hold you until you die.
To be on that boulevard, for me, is to be that beacon of hope of no matter where you come from, no matter what you've done, you can come out of that, because that same boulevard I sold drugs on. Directly across the street from where my office is used to sit a bar called The Nightlife, that I've sold drugs out of that bar for a number of years, inside and out. So to have my business on Martin Luther King Boulevard and to show people that, yes, I was that one drug dealer that ran up and down the street and sold drugs and did all that stuff there, I'm now a changed person, and I'm now somebody that they can aspire to also.
Executive clemency was a bittersweet victory, to be honest with you, because it didn't take me very long after I got out and the excitement and the exhilaration wore off that I realized that I may be free, but so many of my friends and other people aren't. And as long as they're not, then I'm not really. So I started the Can Do Foundation, which is Clemency for All Nonviolent Drug Offenders, to try to continue to help some of the women I left behind. I did time with Danielle, Barbara, Mary Richardson. They've all done well over 20 years. These are all guys who are serving life. These are for pot. He's for LSD. I have just got back from Washington, D.C. I was there for a fundraiser about the whole clemency project that's happening. And in fact, I took all these guys to the in front of the White House. And anyway, there's several of them that I stood out in front of the White House advocating for their clemency.
When I started practicing law almost 40 years ago, there were about 500,000 people in prison. And today there are 2.3 million people in prison. The rate of incarceration, the number of people in prison per 100,000 has gone up from about 130, 140 to over 700 per 100,000. There's an enormous increase in the number of people we are locking up in our society in the course of my professional career.
Billions of dollars have been poured into the prison expansion. Not only of the federal prison capacity, but billions have been sent to state and local governments to expand their prison capacity. And during the 1990s, we were building on average a prison a week. And as soon as these prisons were built, it's important to emphasize, they were immediately filled up with prisoners. And even today, many of our prison facilities are operating beyond their design capacity.
If you compare the US with other industrialized nations, Canada, Western Europe, we lock up our citizens at 5 to 10 times the rate of those other nations. It's not that we have 5 or 10 times the rate of crime of those other nations, but we have consciously chosen to have a much more punitive approach to crime than other comparable nations have, and that's the result that we see in mass incarceration.
America is supposed to be the land of the free, and when you discover how many people that are being locked up in our prisons, it should make people sit up and take notice.
I often get asked, how did you feel, how do you feel now, having written federal laws that are probably the most unjust federal laws that have ever been written? 15,000 people go to prison every year with, getting these mandatory sentences, so this is 20 years, this is, 300,000 people who've gotten these mandatory sentences I played a role in writing. It's horrifying. If I'd been a better attorney, maybe I could have, if I'd been craftier, maybe if I'd taken, they might not have been as bad. I'm grateful that I've had the opportunity now since 1989 to try to end these laws. Fortunately, many former prisoners, many prisoners who write to me are grateful for the work that I'm doing. And I take a great deal of solace that I'm in a position where I can sort of help try to end these mandatories.
What keeps me going are the children. And the love that the parent has for their child and the love that the child has for their parent. The children's love is pretty unconditional. Pretty unconditional. And they don't stop loving you just because you're behind bars.
My name's Brett Jellicoe, 126-3706. My first encounter with the prison system started pretty young. Lifestyle, the drugs, started early. The thing with me was, I got out in February, I think it was 2012. Within 3 months, I got out, paid my court fines, paid my restitution, paid child support, paid everything. I was at zero. I started my own business. I got a vehicle, had tags, had license and everything. In October that year, I decided to smoke some weed. And I thought the worst case scenario, if I go to probation offices, is that I have to go to a program where I had to be urine test regularly, or go to NA and AA meetings. Well, the reality of the fact is, a dirty urine is a violation. And the probation officer I had was new, and she was a stickler for the law, and she violated me there on the spot. I wept like a little child. I couldn't believe I made all this work. I'm like, I have all this to show you. Look at all this. I've done it. She's like, you've done a lot, but you're still using drugs, and it's against the law. I got sentenced to 4 years for a dirty urine analysis. It's a lot watching your children grow up and miss you and wave and say bye, Daddy, as they're walking out of a visit. It's just, it doesn't get easy, you know what I'm saying? And as you get older, you think you become more accustomed to this, but it never, under any circumstances, gets easier. Hey guys, how you doing? First off, Zen, I want to say thank you for spending as much time as you do at the house, watching everybody while Mom's at work. I know you miss out on playtime. I know you miss out on a lot of things. So I just wanted to start off by saying thank you. I'm proud of you for wrestling. I'm glad you're sticking with it. I know you're getting sore, but just like I said, try to stick with it. And, buddy, you're the man of the house. Do the best you can. Take out the trash. Try to stick to your manners. I love you, and I'm so very proud of you. And your haircut looks wonderful. I'm glad you're growing up so fast. From 7 to 13, you've really grown up. And I'm sorry I'm not there to guide you as much as I like, but
You're turning out pretty good, and I'm very, very proud of you. I really am. Now, on a lighter note, Seren, my baby. I love you and I miss you very much. Recently, you just got honor roll. I'm so very proud of you. I know you worked hard. Mom was telling me how you were doing, and you're just growing up so fast. And knucklehead, my little knucklehead, Brody. I want you to know that I love you and I miss you very much. I have a book here. It says When I Miss You. There's a bunch of books that I went through, and this is the one that I thought would be more appropriate. So, anytime you think of me, you're missing me. There's a guinea pig who's going through the same things with his mom when she goes to work. I love you and I miss you all, and I hope to see you soon. Daddy loves you. Bye.
I think that's good. It was a little harder than I thought.
Because of the fact that so many of us have lived for 30 years in this box of mandatory sentences and federal sentencing guidelines and, you know, the drug war, we have to start breaking out of that box and thinking about a world outside of those confines.
If you're interested in reducing the injustice and reducing mass incarceration, you have to go to the root of the problem, which is too many laws on the books. And what is the primary problem there as far as prioritizing which laws ought to go first? The top of my list is the drug laws, because I think we're in another situation where it's very similar to the days of alcohol prohibition, where the government has just declared millions and millions of people to be criminals, and that's what they've done with these drug laws. So we have to move away from the drug war the same way in which we moved away from alcohol prohibition. There will be some problems when that's done, but that's far and away the primary problem that needs to be addressed.
The danger of looking at one outrageous case after another can blind you to the broader perspective that there are so many of these cases, that these are actually the typical pattern. This is the system. It is broadly unjust, and that it is so wasteful, it's so counterproductive, it's so inefficient. One has to be outraged. Why does it continue? Why are we unable to stop promptly, more efficiently, a policy that's been going on since 1986 of locking up so many low-level offenders and treating them as major kingpins? That's a very deeply disturbing indictment, that we're willing to waste so much treasure and inflict so much harm and cause so much injustice in a society where our credos are about liberty and justice for all.